Well, today I am joined by Suzanne Dikker, a researcher whose work lives at the intersection of neuroscience, art, and education. Susanna is known for bringing brain science and brain research out of the lab and into the real world settings, from classrooms and public schools to collaborative art experiences. Her work explores how our brains synchronize when we learn, create, and connect, and what that can teach us about human connection, collaboration, and the future of neuroscience. I'm super excited to explore how her interdisciplinary approach is reshaping how we study the brain and who gets to access that knowledge. Susanna, it's so great to have you. I have been a big fan of your work for so many years, and it's great to have you for this conversation today. So maybe to start off with, as I mentioned in your background, your work is so interdisciplinary, and so maybe we can just get started by talking a little bit about how you got into this blend of neuroscience, art, and education, and what projects are you working on right now?
Yeah, well, so first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's really great to see you again, and I am so grateful for your support over the years. And yeah, as I said, like honored to be here and to talk about my work and about the work that we do together. And you were actually very much at at the origins of how I got into the work that I do today. Like we developed the first, hyperscanning setup together with Jeff, your engineer, like
Yes.
trying to figure out how we might record data from multiple brains at the same time. Like he was like really closely involved in working on us with our initial pipeline. So yeah, super grateful. But just to answer your question, so my background, like as a when I was young, I did arts. I started to be a dancer and a painter, and then I veered away from that into linguistics first. I got super fascinated in college by how diversity in languages and how we do that, and also especially how the bilingual brain supports speaking multiple languages at the same time. And then I wanted to study how the brain does that. And I went to NYU to do research on the brain basis of having multiple languages in your brain and how you process and communicate fast and efficiently. But we would always do these studies in the lab, with words that were presented, with like, I don't know, a couple of 50 millisecond or 100 millisecond intervals, and not at all like how we naturally communicate with each other, right? And we've learned so much from all that laboratory research, but I realized that I wanted to really study how we communicate in real life settings and test whether this model of social communication really works. And so I did a postdoc at the Sackler Institute for Developmental Psychobiology. And through that work, serendipitously got connected. So I was already doing work in fMRI on communication, got connected to Marina Abramovic, the performance artist. And so that was the first project that we did together, measuring the magic of mutual gaze. It's about, I don't know, a little while ago, 2 years ago, like 10, I think it's
That
more
work
like
was
10
really
years ago.
simple. It was amazing.
Yeah. And she had just done her work The Artist is Present at the MoMA, where she sat in front of audience members for with like in silent mutual gaze for anywhere ranging from minutes to hours. And we did a project with her on what the relationship is between eye contact and this intense emotional connection that people feel, and whether you can measure this connection associated with mutual gaze in real life settings. So with you, we generated this. We built a museum installation restaged The Artist is Present in the Garage Center for Contemporary Culture in Moscow, and that became a traveling exhibition. And also spurred all sorts of other fun collaborations, like the Compatibility Racer, where people sit and try to move a car that goes faster as brainwave synchrony increases, and it slows down as it decreases.
I had so many questions. I remember that work on mutual gaze so well because it was incredible to me to see that it was possible for us to measure that. Because I was so taken aback by Marina's work when the art around the artist is present, because I read newspaper write-ups about it where people would sit there and after a while, some people broke down and started crying, right? It
Yeah.
was extremely evocative. And even though it was a very passive experience, it was emotionally very evocative. So there was something that stirs inside people that was hard for us to kind of comprehend as a bystander. And so I was really fascinated by the fact that we could now see when the brains actually started to synchronize. So from that study and from that exhibit, was there a period of time, or does it vary a lot between individuals in terms of how long it takes to establish this sense of neural synchrony? Is there a method to as to getting this to happen?
So I don't know yet, even though I've been studying this for, like about a decade now. I'm not sure that I know the precise answer to that question. We do know that there's a lot of individual variation between people when it comes to, synchronizing and how different they are. And there's a lot of, personality impacted, especially how personally distressed you are. If you're a person who gets very stressed out, if there's a social situation that is feels like that it's heavy in emotion, then you're not going to synchronize as much with the people around you. But what we're finding mostly is that it's a process of negotiation. So if you think about and also, we used to always think that synchrony is always a good thing, but actually, if you stop to think about it, we don't. We build bridges so that they don't over synchronize, right? And we want to make sure that that the resonance is not too much. So what we're actually realizing is that it's probably more like a process of negotiation where you flow in and out of sync, and it's about whether or not you're tuned into each other to negotiate that interaction. Like in our conversation, for example, at some point, I am going to reach a moment where you're going to want to jump in, and that's like it goes up and then it kind of like fizzles out, and then you're like, oh, you grab that moment, and you're like, okay, now I can come in, and it's kind of like this mutual tension and prediction situation. So it's dynamic, is what the answer is that I would give to that.
And so what does it tell us? When two brains are in sync, what does it mean about the human connection at that moment? I think just so that someone who's just watching this for the first time, they don't know anything about neural synchrony, let's break it down for the viewer. What does it mean when we our brains are in
It can mean various different things. So we use the word synchrony to refer to actually quite a few different phenomena where we're talking about similarities in the time course between your brain rhythms and my brain rhythms. But the brain rhythms operate at different frequencies, kind of like a radio, you have different stations. And so, just like a radio, you can also synchronize and on different stations. So you might synchronize with each other if you are doing something together in beta, for example, over your motor cortex. If the task is really to like make sure that you solve a puzzle together, for example. And then if you're in sync with each other at that level, at that frequency, you might perform better. It's also probably a good thing that you are attentive at the same time, which is like modulations in alpha power. So if and we are never attentive for like 45 minutes straight. It's just not really possible. So we flow in and out of attention, and then we could see that, for example, it's good if like your flow might be like this, and if mine is kind of the same, then we're in sync, and that offers opportunities for us to build shared representations, to understand each other better. If there's no alignment, if you're attentive now and I'm attentive now, then we're engaging and learning different things about the environment, right? So it's all about moments of coming together and then flowing apart and coming together again.
And does it require communication to establish the synchrony, or I assume you can establish synchrony with someone even before any words are exchanged?
Yes. Oh, you mean verbal communication. So,
Yes.
you all you need, I think, is like it could be that your baselines are the same. Like if you have very similar rhythms, you might be in sync as you're just sitting there, right? Like, and you're even if you're not in the same room. That's probably just, a coincidence then that happens, that you're like you just happen to have the same rhythms. Usually there's some sort of common input. So it could be that if you're watching a movie together, the movie, or you're listening to me, or you when you're talking, people in the audience, their brains might synchronize because their brains are tagging on to what we're saying. Um, but if we're synchronizing with each other, we know actually that eye contact is a really strong predictor of brain interbrain synchrony, but we don't really know why. We know it's a really strong social cue, but we don't really know what you're like tagging onto. If you're like looking for microsaccades or little indications of the emotions of somebody else. So yeah, definitely nonverbal is very possible. Laughter is a great synchronizer, as you
Oh,
can.
yes, I can imagine.
Yeah.
You've studied neural synchrony for a decade now. Are there moments where it has surprised you when you have observed neural synchrony and just thinking, how is this even possible? Or maybe even amongst two people who've been together for a long time, has there been anything that really surprised you about how this phenomenon shows itself?
Well, there's one that is about the public engagement. Like it keeps on I keep on being positively surprised by how, what you're saying, like how much it speaks to the imagination of people. So that is one thing that I get a lot of joy out of that. People love thinking about these questions around social connectedness, what makes our brain sync. And then when it comes to findings, there are a couple of findings that I found really interesting, that I think are worth exploring further. So one of them, for example, that I think is fairly important to know, to like investigate, is that we did studies in the classroom where we recorded brain waves from entire classrooms for the full school year, and each class we asked them to do a bunch of different things, like sit, watch a video, listen to a lecture, and have a class discussion. So those were educational activities, and we asked them to like before each lecture to like turn to each other and then engage in eye contact. But these were teenagers, so they wasn't just like 2 minutes of eye contact. They might have been paired with their crush or their frenemy. So there was no way that they were just like sitting still, a Marina Abramovich style in that setting, right? So there was a lot going on. And then we would measure the brain activity during the lecture afterward. And so what I found surprising about those settings is that, for first of all, what we saw is that we saw that synchrony increased for those kids who had just engaged with each other, which you can is in, like you can kind of be like, oh well, they're still resonating maybe. But what we also saw is that, how close students felt to each other, and these were kids that had known each other for 10 years or so.
Yes.
That only came online, so to speak. We could only see that reflected in their synchrony. Like kids who liked each other better were more synchronous during the class, but only if they had this like moment of engagement. And so what that means is that you have to reactivate your social connection often. And the other
Yes.
thing we learned is that it matters what kind of person you are in a social setting, how much how you synchronize with each other. So even if you're not directly interacting, so if you're in a movie theater, your social personality will impact how you synchronize with the people around you. So yeah, those are really interesting findings, I thought.
Is there any prediction of, neural synchrony as a mechanism for to unlock better teamwork, for example, or better dynamics within your own personal relationships? How should we think about um, neural synchrony in that context?
There again, I think it's two pronged, right? So, one, you have the awareness, just knowing. So, there's a lot of discussion and conversation now around how, society is harmed by us not engaging face to face. We have, social communications channels that are digitally interfaced. And I think if we are more made aware more and made more constantly, repetitively aware. Unfortunately, it's not just a one-off thing that, in this kind of social interaction setting that we have right now, synchrony is disrupted, right? Like we are born with, because there's delays in the system. So we're born with an architecture that has delays built into it. It takes about 20 milliseconds for an auditory signal to get to your auditory cortex, and you have to process it and you have to react. And so if you're singing a song together in real life, there's actually a lot of adjustments of
Yes.
delays
Yes.
going on in real life. And we're used to those. And then you bring in digital communication, like the way we're talking right now, and you're seeing that these delays are different. Maybe they're like not always constant, maybe there's a jitter. And we know that we've like learned to do these really tight turn taking dynamics, and we implicitly derive a lot of meaning and intention from that. So for example, when you're nodding, I implicitly understand the moments of your nods to be in moments where I take cues. It's like, oh, she's not, if you take too long, I'm like, maybe she wasn't listening. Or if you nod too much in certain moments, I'm like, oh, maybe I should stop talking because she has a question that she wants to get in there, and that's really hard to navigate. And so you might exit a virtual conversation feeling like somebody was interruptive or wasn't interested, whereas that wasn't the case. And I think we don't really fully understand that. Like we should actually sing happy birthday together now or something to show, like, and because you know how bad it is, right? Like if you've ever had a Zoom call on a birthday party, you try to do that, you're like, oh, that doesn't work. But with conversation is rhythmic-ish, but flexible enough that we don't notice it, but it's still very detrimental.
I was curious. You've done a lot of mapping of neural synchrony in classrooms, which is something we care about a lot, which is this idea of real world neuroscience. Right? And so, what is the biggest learning that you took away from studying kids in the classroom in terms of the learning experience? What could we do better?
What can we do better as educators in the classroom?
Yeah, or
Uh,
how do students behave when they're learning together in a classroom that you
yeah,
could measure from actually observing their brains?
like I really, I mean, a cop out answer maybe, but I think teachers know best. I really believe that. I think the teachers know better than I do what a good strategy is in their classroom. I do
Yes, because 'cause they're
think
there,
that
they're present. Yeah.
they're present, they know their kids, and I think I'm not surprised, but I'm like, or puzzled, but something along those lines by how if teachers ever come to us to be like, okay, what have we learned that we should do, and what it does, I mean, like the teachers that are there asking that question, they clearly
Yes.
care about their students, and so their students are going to perform well. That
They
would be my
benefit from that
answer.
already because of
Um,
their yeah.
yeah, and a lot of it is classics, right? Like we provide, I think the value that we add to that is that we provide neurobiological support for the things that they already knew. And I think we can have play a really strong role there. So for example, if we find that student brains are more tired at 8:20 in the morning, everybody knew this. You don't have to do that study, right? Like we know that you're more that teenagers should probably not be in classrooms or driving their cars at 8:30 in the morning.
Yes.
However, if you get a headline, neuroscience study says X, Y, or Z, that supports additional evidence that you can use for policymakers, for example.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and I think with learning, that's the same with like the synchrony question. If the awareness is what I'm saying, like bringing this technology to classrooms and making students aware of the fact that their brains and their social environment are contributing to their learning outcomes, that the rhythms of their brains and bodies are important and relevant, that if you are there with a device that you're distracted on, that your brain waves cannot synchronize with your teacher and you might not be learning as much if you
Yes.
do that, then I think that's high value. And I also think from a pure educational perspective, bringing these technologies in the classroom really gives agency to youth to understand better what kind of data scientists, policy, governments, military, who else is using and wants to use from their data, sometimes for good and sometimes to just sell things to, right? Like we're all like, we're in a capitalist society, so we're all, selling each other things. And that's not a bad thing. But I think we need to make sure that this balancing act, that the playing field is equal. I think that's the most important thing. And the only way to do that, in my view, is to give people as much knowledge as you can to allow them to make informed decisions about these kinds of things. And I think it's a really fun and engaging way to allow students to engage with their own brain and body activity in the classroom. It gives them a sense of, ownership over themselves, pride and questioning, and yeah, that's all around, and I learn a lot from that too. It's so much fun, teams
Oh,
are.
I can imagine. It would be fascinating to do that. So, what have you observed with the kids if they've not had access to this technology and they, for the first time, they get to see their own brains? You talked a little bit about the agency. what changes have you observed in the kids?
We have programs. MindHive is a program where we support students to do human behavioral science studies, and then You Quantified is a program that supports them to engage with their own data, brain, body, voice, facial expressions, and create data visualization projects. And within those two projects, what we really want to do is put them in a sense, give them a sense of community, not just within their classroom but also outside. So we have platform that connects them to students who are also engaging in our programs at the same time. Those students participate in their studies. We have science mentors who provide feedback for their initial ideas, and students reflect on each other's projects, even if they're not in the same class. And so one thing we find as a group, at the group level, we find that students do feel more agency, more understanding of science, better sense of like biases in design and in their design and in their interpretation of data. But here too, funny enough, like we're born as we're storytellers at the essence. Even though I'm a scientist and I'm supposed to be a generalist, it's the stories that stick with you most. And so one story that I thought was incredible was really made it kind of all worth it, the hassle, because it's not always easy, of course.
Yes.
Um, is this example of a teacher who told us about one student who was really struggling to the extent that he had to like often sit alone in the learning setting. It was very, kind of a sad and isolating and downward spiraling moment. And he created designed a study about attention deficit disorder. And then he sent it out into the world, and he saw that like 30 students from other schools in New York City and in Memphis and Boston like participated in his study, and
Wow.
he like completely opened up and like something switched in him. I'm not saying that we changed him, and I'm not it might be a moment, and then he might, I don't know where the
Yes.
student ended up, like we didn't follow up with him. But those are moments that we're going for, right? Like
Yes.
like trying to make these kinds of changes possibly in these settings. Yeah, that would be that's the best reward you can get.
So, when you think about democratization of neuroscience and the tools, what impact do you think this can have on the next generation of scientists, artists, and creators like yourself? Right, you reflect on back when you were the budding dancer and artist, and if you had access to these tools, what do you think it could enable for the next generation?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm a little bit hesitant to answer that question because I feel like we're in a moment where and maybe this is of all times in some ways, but I feel like we're in a true moment of weird acceleration in different directions. And there are days where I'm really pessimistic about it, and there are days where I'm really optimistic about it, right? And so I'm very optimistic about, the ability that the technology affords to, to have, as I was saying, like to like get direct access to your data to allow you to make informed decisions. On the other hand, I also don't want to be naive about it. Like, just to give an example, we were this was an installation that we did, the mutual wave machine, where you show light patterns as a function of how synchronized you are. And I was there, like the lead scientist was there physically. I'm not typically not there because we collect data from thousands of people in museums. Like, I'm not there always as a scientist to explain in detail what is going on. We have operators, sometimes from the museums, or people go through experiences on their own, and we hope that they, take away the right message from what we're
Yes.
doing. And so this isn't just an anecdote. There were two kids. They were in there, and we were like explaining, this is we don't really know what drives synchrony. You're participating in a study. Thank you so much for contributing your data. And then they participated, and we're like, oh wow, you had a lot of moments of synchrony. That's amazing. And then they walked away, and I heard the dad say, the scientists, to like his wife, I think, who wasn't there, like, the scientist said that this means they're really smart. And I was like, there was nothing that I ever said about intelligence or anything
No.
like that. I think this is part of the problem with science communication. So like if you look at what we want is for people to trust scientists and to trust that, and we want to be trustworthy, right? Like we need to have like systems in place that there's no fraud, there's no motivation to not, and but most scientists are in it for the knowledge. um, I think we have a really important role to play here to make sure that as scientists and industry, that we make sure that we you know, follow our own code of honor with respect to what we're telling the public that our technology can give them, and then hopefully also monitor and try to correct when things are
Yes.
misinterpreted.
Yes, exactly. And I think it can be very challenging if they've misinterpreted what you said, um, and have put their own cognition layer over it, right?
Yeah,
Their
the
own
lead
interpretation.
genie is out of the
Yeah.
bottle. It's
Yes.
insane, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that can be very challenging because you can't really anticipate all of the unintended um perceptions of what how people perceive that experience to be and what we're actually measuring.
So can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Or is that
Yeah,
like because
absolutely.
I'm really curious how you go about that, because we have like IRB boards that, like, you know, and like there's we you know, and federal agencies that like breathe down our necks appropriately so to make
For
sure that
sure.
we, and you kind of have to self-regulate a bit, right? And at the same time compete. And like, can you give an example of where you feel that that worked really, what you're really proud of, or a moment of learning or something along those lines? Or
There's always moments of learning. I think, Susanna, the reality with neurotech is that we're working through at a pace that is accelerating. And so for us, it's a process of constant engagement in order to make sure that we stay as current as possible. So I'm very actively engaged with, for example, the Global Future Council around neurotechnology so that we can talk about consumer neurotechnologies and what this means. How do we actually establish a neurotrust index? What does that encompass so that consumers who are starting to touch these technologies, what should they be looking for and how do you establish trust? And you're absolutely right, it's about consistency as one of the elements. It's about information and awareness, and it's about education. A lot of it is around educating the public, but also being consistent. The challenge that we have with this accelerated pace of change is that we have to explain to people the notion of not just informed consent, but the notion of informed risk as well when it comes to this technology. Because yes, whilst you're what we know today may not be what we know tomorrow. And so
yeah,
whilst
so
we
true.
may provide a framework for consent of what we know is possible today, there are some risks that we don't know that we may be able to um, interpret and understand down, you know, the line in the future. And there is a risk element associated with that. And we need to also inform our customers about that. And so that they have the full arc of that piece, what we know and what we also don't know, right? And I think that conversation is an ongoing process. It is not an easy one, but we try our best and to engage. And I think that's the only thing that you can do.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's a moving landscape as well. So there's a lot of regulations that are coming out at the moment, some of which is intended to provide more clarity, but because of the differences in different jurisdictions, it can be quite confusing and it can be quite challenging for an operator in this space. And so, we often default to the more rigorous standards because it's easier to comply with that and then apply it across the board rather than to have different arrangements for people. So,
Yeah.
but it's a challenging space. I have to admit, it's not an easy process. You have to be very aware and very actively engaged.
Yeah, it's so, I mean, I'm just thinking about, I think it, because yeah, it really resonates. And because I'm thinking about these presentations, it was so much easier even just 5 years ago when I was like giving a presentation. I was like, oh, you know, and I showed some like terrible raw signal from, you know, like because they were moving. we can show people that, the data, the raw data, and that we can't really read their minds from these data. And then more and more studies come out where you're like, okay, I still don't think we're out there with like reading people's minds. But then, like, at some point your narrative kind of changes where you're like, yet, or you're like, I don't actually
Yes.
know what this data shows, and what, in some conditions maybe we can learn things about these people that they never signed up for. I think one of the challenges is that, the answer from some people is to retreat, right? And to just not partake, which is totally, I think, great. And you should do that if you don't feel comfortable. But it's also a bit of, I don't know that that's the answer either, to opt out, like, and then what about all the people who don't? Or
I
like, how,
think that that's the reason why education and awareness is so important from
yeah.
our standpoint. It's because I think people naturally fear what they don't know. And so
Yeah.
the more you can educate, the more you can raise awareness, the more democratizing these technologies can be, the more informed people have the chance to become, right, about the technology, and it reduces the barriers to entry. It allows for a much more active and engaged conversation. And that's the best frameworks that we can have is an engaged audience that understands and that can provide the push and pull. So just going back to STEM, you've worked in STEM education across New York. What is the biggest shift that you've seen in how students engage with science today?
So I don't know if I can properly answer that question, because I don't think, I mean, I started studying. I mean, like, we've done projects like brainwaves, also using it with you guys, in schools. Like, before the pandemic, where we supported students in recording their brain activity, and then you had the pandemic, and then
Yes.
now you have AI. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question. It's just like, where do you? On the one hand, it's like, where do you start? On the other hand, it's like, as a scientist, how do you disentangle and dissociate all these factors that contribute to the way students were educated? So you could say that, I mean, COVID, clearly accelerated digital education, and I think it was a really good thing. My son was remained engaged with school because of Zoom, right, and devices, and so I think it was a perfect thing. And then we came back, and then you had, I don't know if a perfect storm or an imperfect storm, that you have this, like, all these digital tools that were developed that then they kept using, and now you have generative AI. And I don't think anybody has the answer to, in what I've read and learned, and I'm not an expert, but even
Yeah.
people who are experts or claim to be experts, I'm not sure that anybody knows exactly where the dust will settle on this, right? So
Right.
I read the quote the other day, like, it's either the end of the world, or it's like either human extinction, or it's like elevation. I do know in my own teaching that, some things are just less fun, but anymore, like, there's nobody really wants to police their students on whether they did something themselves or not. Like, no teacher is interested in being a policeman for their kids, right? And their students. And so instead, what you end up doing is going back to some, previously thought of archaic tools in your, where there's more intellectual engagement within the lecture setting. Like, you don't, for example, where I bring blue books back, like actual physical, pen and paper. And we've known for a while that kids learn better. Often they integrate knowledge better if they're physically engaged with it rather than digitally, right? And reading, active reading, and that you're distracted by, any teenager will figure out a way to hack around your barrier, right? Like, and it's because that's their job. That's what their brain is telling
They're
them to
wired
do.
to do that,
Hack
yes.
around your barriers. That's what they're supposed to do. So, what are we going to do? Have like a battle battle with the babies? No, like, you want to. So I think, yeah, I don't know. So, but that was so on STEM education, though. I do think that there. I'm really positive, and it's amazing. Like, so when we now have the ability to build a web-based platform that streams your data, uses open tool softwares. There's so much phenomenal things like P5JS and streamings, and like people and amazing communities around, data visualization, data interpretation. That's really fun. And I think that STEM has, may have, it was, to some, in some direction, it's become much more accessible by taking away some barriers where at first you needed 2 years for students to build a thing. Now you need only a couple of months. You don't need to install anything. So I think that opens up so many fabulous doors when it comes to data engagement for sure. Yeah.
So, Susanna, I'm really fascinated by the intersection of art and science because, there's science can be very dry and it can be quite challenging for some people to engage, but art is quite different. People can really engage. And so when you bring the two together, what has it taught you? Because you've done a lot of work in this space as well. How do you think the intersection of art and science can actually allow us to touch new audiences and maybe bring out more context or awareness that just science alone can't achieve by itself?
So these kinds of collaborations are like they're pure joy because you learn from people who come at a question from a slightly different angle. But I do think, and this is that there's we are both artists and scientists are looking for the right question to ask. And the difference is that scientists are supposed to go out and look for that question, and artists can just throw the question at you and just leave it at that, right? And like explore the question. And then there's like the balancing act of human individual stories, as we were saying earlier, like the human story, like art is often focused on that, and then the science generalizes over that. So it's a beautiful, in that sense, a beautiful collaboration, and we can be complementary and synergistic in many ways. The art science collaborations that work best are the ones where we're also everybody allows each other to kind of step in their zone for a second. There's nobody who's protective of their turf, really. Understanding, of course, that you're not an expert in each other's fields, right? But you feel safe and are allowed to ask questions. So that are about neuroscientists if you're an artist, or about art if you're or put in ideas if we're co-creating a performance or a project together. um, Neuroscientists you should be allowed artistic ideas, and so we work across these collaborations. As you were saying, we're tapping into different audiences. So audiences who might come to our to dance performances might be, hopefully pleasantly surprised that they're also engaging in a science related experience. And hopefully vice versa, right? So I do think personally, if other scientists are a little bit like me, that it is very important and grounding to every now and then be, reset to the essence of what it is to be human, because that's what we're studying as neuroscientists and psychologists. And art is really, if there's maybe nothing as, core human as artistic expression. I think we all engage in it in one form or another, and we most of us really enjoy perceiving it. It is emotional, it's healing. The amount of research coming out on the importance of arts in our lives, just purely for preventing heart disease, and premature death. Like it's Alzheimer's. It's incredible. And I'm a curious person. I always want to learn from everybody. I always kind of want to be everybody, which is not possible. But the closest thing possible is to collaborate closely. And so by collaborating closely with professional dancers, I get inspired for my own questions. So, for example, we talk about synchrony, and you were like, "Oh, what is synchrony?" And we kind of been glossing over that a little bit as a scientific community as well. And so, together with dancers, we've worked for years on really on creating a vocabulary around a scientific vocabulary and a body vocabulary around synchrony, the vehicles that promote synchrony. And it came to questions like one of the core questions that arose from that is what, for example, the difference is between doing something together or doing something simultaneously, which is intuitively something that I don't have to explain to you. Like simultaneity at the same time is different from together, but it's not necessarily easy to measure it or to just do it on command, right? And another example that I'm really intrigued about currently is we've done research on synchrony, and in the immediate for a while, right? Like the people that you're interacting with directly. So you and I are interacting directly, and through conversation, we might synchronize and we might have good social emotional outcomes around our relationship. But we don't know that much about whether that has a ripple effect, right? Like, does my interaction with you build my trust in society at large, for example? And I'm really, really intrigued in that question. And it came from an art collaboration This artist, Bogomir Doringer, who grew up in the 90s in ex-Yugoslavia when it was falling apart, he found his cure and solace in rave culture. And he's been doing a project over the past 10 years called I Dance Alone, where he has traveled and documented the movement dynamics of dance floors, often in countries that are under democratic distress. So in Eastern Europe, in Kiev, in Georgia, in Belarus, I think one of them he had a hard time coming in. I forget which one, but and that really like initiated questions around me. We work at festivals a lot, where I was like, okay, so I think everybody feels like something is like, there's something off, and we have a choice now, or I don't know. I mean, like, I don't mean to sound so dramatic, but there's something. Many people feel that there's something in the air, right? And like you see dance culture popping up as a form of coping or resistance or whatever you want to call it. And I'm really intrigued by that. Made me really intrigued by that question. And I realized as I was like looking for a survey or something that asked that we haven't asked that question really. It's about oh, maybe somebody from a politically different, you do Republicans and Democrats. There's a lot of work on that, but there's not that much work on like when we're synchronizing, when we're dancing, when we're interacting face to face, do we actually feel, do we trust that other people, some random person on the other side of the world, wants to make the world a better place just because we dance with each other? And I hope that's true, because that would be wonderful. Then because then all we need to do is organize dance parties. But yeah.
Right. Oh, fascinating. Um, uh, Before I forget, I'm very curious about the bilingual brain as well.
I actually haven't studied the bilingual brain in a little while. But there is, there's like one thing that I find fascinating about is this like speaking of earlier we were talking about how myths get like sent into society and get really pervasive, and
Yes.
there's this thing that somebody probably just invented, like said, oh, that's a good thing to do 100 years ago. We're like one parent, one language, right? So you speak your language to your child, and then the other person, and you stick to it because otherwise they might get confused. I don't think that's true. And I think it's also in practice really confusing,
Uh,
because
yeah.
if you're thinking about a setting and your child wants to understand what's going on, or they want to be involved in the conversation, then your task is to exclude them from the conversation because you now have to speak another language to them. It's very strange.
Yes.
And there's been a lot of misinformed policy around bilingualism, where like parents are told to speak the language of the country, if so the complete opposite to their children, so that kids grow up with half languages. But yeah, overall, we know that bilingual brain, like, it's not a bad thing for you. That's one thing. If anything, it increases cognitive control and like switch, like it has trickle down or trickle up effects to other fields of cognition with focus. There's like studies suggesting that. And yeah.
I'm curious. Before we sign off, I wanted to ask you. You've been using emotive gear in your work for a long time in classrooms, in performances, in research. Can you share with us what it's enabled for you?
Well, a motive has made it all possible. Like if it wasn't for you and Jeff to begin with, like I don't think I would have ever started, any of it. So there's that part. So you've been enabling it through your continuous support as humans and as a company, and a trust in us. But the technology itself, I also think is perfect, as perfect as it gets with the field that is out there, right? So I think that in that sense, that what I mean by that is that we study brains of people with all sorts of hair types, for example, and your design is like so much better than a cap for that. Like you can just like go in there and fit it in. The saline is much better than dry electrodes or than
Yes.
gel. It's
Yes.
kind of, and the form factor of the epoch, especially, I'm talking especially about the epoch because I know that one best. The form
Yes.
factor of the epoch is also, I think, that it has the perfect. It feels and is, collects real scientific EEG data. It doesn't look like a toy, and I think that's one thing that some other, like I'm not saying that we use other devices also, But when it comes to educate kids, for example, in the classroom, engaging with emotive headsets, they feel like they're actually using a scientific tool, and they're prouder being able to use emotive than, a band or something like that, the EPUB, because it's like there's actual stuff that you need to do, and you need to, so they get pride, they gain pride, they feel like they've interacted with a real scientific instrument. And so
Wow, I
that's,
love that feedback. I never would have actually gleaned that from myself. So thank you for that. So what do you think we'll be able to eventually understand about human behavior through being able to conduct this sort of real world neuroscience that we don't know yet?
well, so earlier you asked, and I don't know that I answered that question per se, about like teams, for example. Like I had a conversation actually earlier today with some researchers who were like, well, there's a lot of, there's a lot of money is spent on training, on team training, and we don't really know how effective all of those trainings are. This is not my expertise, so I don't, I'm just, I don't want to say that they're not effective, but it might be worth, they were saying that it might be worth looking for alternative ways also to ensure that, surgical teams or like are effective. And one contributing factor could be, your baseline, jive. I don't know what another, and like maybe
I love it.
maybe
Baseline.
maybe neural synchrony can be a contributing measure in that when you form teams at the get-go. So I don't
We should
know
be
that.
using it for matchmaking. You thought that when you were saying the space
Oh,
one, yeah,
totally. But that's
I
the, yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like for like the matchmaking, like we should, like, yeah, for dating is an next, it would be so fun. Let's do that. Let's like set up an event.
it would be really fascinating.
Yeah, you can do a speed dating event, and part of what you're doing is you're selected in part based on your on your synchrony. And I don't mean to claim that synchrony will never explain all of it, right? Like it often explains little of it significantly explains stuff, but it doesn't explain all of the variance in what is going on. So I would never rely on whether your brains are in sync to get divorced or stay married or like what, like just don't. But it's a fun additional contributing factor, and maybe it does actually help you, enter, for example, a team relationship or a real relationship in a
I
romantic
love it.
relationship
I
as like,
love it.
oh,
I love
we
it so
are
much
on the
more.
same wavelength. Yeah,
Let's do it. I think that's a
yeah, I would
fascinating
love that.
study.
Done.
Susanna, thank you so much for spending the time with me. This was fascinating, and I'm really excited for your research, and I will could definitely continue to watch it. Let's do that. That
Yes,
next collaboration.
please.
Love it.
And yeah, thank you again so much, and I can't wait to see what you guys have in store and what other people are doing with your technology also, because there's like so much incredibly inspiring stuff going on, and really, yeah, thank you for being who you are, like, and
Thank you
supporting
so
us.
much.